Hello everybody, today I want to show you 5 more sound design tips and tricks that I've recently picked up, starting out with layering. As you can see over here we have a sound that is playing like this. Pretty simple stuff I would say, but just having that in part of your track isn't really that interesting. So in this particular case what I decided to add is a few claps and percussions, stuff like this. And the main thing that I wanted to tell you is that, as you can probably tell, these two sounds, they are not really connected with each other. And I hear a lot of people when they talk about layering say that it's really important that the sounds that you layer, that they have some kind of correlation. And I disagree with that. At the end of the day, when you're layering stuff on top of each other, you want to take an aspect of one sound and an aspect of another sound, and you want to combine those. And if they're already like very similar sounding, then they're both going to have the same aspects. So then in that case, layering is a little bit useless. So when it comes to layering, what I like to do is most of the time I like to have different sounds perform different functionalities. Here's another good example of that. If I go earlier on in the project, we have this other one shot here, which we'll come back to later as well. As you can see, we have 3 different sounds that we're layering over here. In this particular case, we have one sound that is just one note being held down. We have another sound over here where I'm triggering individual notes, as you can see down here. And then we have a final note over here, which is just playing once. So as you can hear, this is kind of like the main sound of it. This is like the little tremolo thing. But you can hear that we're missing a little bit of body to this sound. So what I wanted to add is stuff like this. But honestly, just a sound like this sounds a little bit boring. Therefore, we have this variation, which is a little bit of a roll. You can hear that there's a few impacts there as opposed to just one, meaning that that individual note is going to stand out a little bit more from the rhythm that we're setting up here. And all of that together is a nice layer for the other sound that we have here, giving it a little bit more body. Now this can bring me immediately into tip 2, and that is what you can see over here. All of these notes are unsynced, in the sense that I'm not actually aligning them to the grid in any way. If I have a note normally, you can see that it's kind of snapping from grid point to grid point. Of course, if I set the grid differently, maybe I set it to 16 notes, it is obviously going to snap to all of the 16 notes here. But in this particular case, I wanted a very human feeling one shot. One of the reasons why I'm able to do that is because this is in the intro. So you can hear there's no actual kick and bass or any rhythmical element to which this can be compared. So just like my last 5 sound design tips for Psytrance video, this tip is going to focus a little bit more on the placement of the notes and the actual triggering of the sound, because that is also important when you're sound designing something. And the main idea is going to be, if you don't have any rhythmical reference point, what you can do is deliberately not place any of these sounds on the grid. And that is going to give it a lot more of a human feel, because there's not going to be a rhythm that is being followed. If just really quickly I go in here and I set quantize settings over here, I'll set this to 1/16 for the start and the end. You can imagine that this sounds a lot more boring, because this is a rhythm that we're familiar with. In a case over here where everything is outside of the grid, you can imagine that this is a rhythm that we aren't really familiar with. This is no indication of BPM or something like that. And because it's not a standard rhythm, because it's not just, oh hey, here's 16 notes, you get this kind of cool, unique idea that is actually going to stand out, as opposed to a rhythm that you may have heard before. Also, of course, because we have this other tremolo sound, which is also not exactly tied to any rhythm or the BPM of our track for that regard. Like there's not really a clear sustained tempo or a clear rhythm in here. Of course, layering something with that also doesn't have a clear rhythm works really well. Now, if I leave this sound play for a little bit, we'll dive into our next tip, which is going to start playing from here. Of course, it's going to start playing on a different sound, but you'll definitely hear that sound when it comes in. The sound that we're going to look at for the third tip is going to be a vocal. It's going to be this one over here. Of course, you heard it before, so I'm not going to play it again. And the main thing that we're going to look at is Harmonizer MB here. Now, as the name implies, this is technically a multi-band plugin, but the interesting thing that you can do with Harmonizer MB is that you can have these bands run in parallel. If I right-click here, it opens up the band configuration, and you can see this is the normal kind of crossover that we're used to, analog linear phase, or linear phase. We have some hybrid things here as well. And then we get into different forms of crossovers, one of which is parallel. And parallel just means that for all of the bands that you're seeing over here, they're all running side by side and all get the same input signal, which is of course going to be just the full spectrum as opposed to it actually chopping up individual parts of the spectrum. Now, when it comes to this Harmonizer plugin, I'm not actually using the Harmonizer capability that you see over here, like I'm not playing any chords with it or something like that on any of the bands. What you'll just see is that for each band, I have a different pitch setup over here. So if I click here, you can see +7, -12, and then +12 over here, and the first one was +19. So you can hear that we're playing some octaves and some perfect fifths, and these are going to be mixed in with the global dry wet over here with the original sound. So we're just essentially taking this vocal and pitching it to 5 different positions, and then layering that on top of the main vocal. What you'll see is that I automate the dry wet over time. We started with a fairly high dry wet, and then when we go lower in the notes, you can see at some point we just go down all the way. And the reason why I do that is because I have input gain over here for this delay, and I don't actually want the harmonizer effect to be delayed out into this portion over here, meaning that at this point in the signal, I don't want any of the harmonizer to be present. Now, of course, you can build your own harmonizer by just using a bunch of different pitch shifters and creating harmonies like that. But having it in an individual plugin is a little bit easier, of course, because then you don't have to link any of the controls or stuff like that. And it is, of course, a lot quicker to set up. The next tip that I want to talk about is resampling, which is a very powerful tool in your arsenal as a sound designer. The main reason why I like to use resampling, though, is not so much for... The main reason why I like to resample is not so much for the actual sound design capabilities that you have, but just because it gives you a visual representation of the waveform and it shows you exactly what the waveform is doing. So here's a good example. I wanted a very clicky sound. So by just looking at the waveform, you can see that we have a lot of clicks in here, meaning that I can kind of verify exactly what is happening with the sound that I'm working on. In this particular case, what is interesting is that we can see that per cycle, we basically get 2 clicks over here. I don't exactly remember how I sound designed this. It may have been that I am actually using unison without any detune, because it doesn't seem like the distance between these 2 clicks is changing over time. Another thing that is interesting and which tends to happen a lot for me is when it comes to delay and reverb, I tend to cut them off a lot of the time. Sometimes I just do it like this. In this case, as you can hear, the delay and reverb is being cut off. But it's just done through the dry and wet of the reverb and the delay over here. Other times, like in this case over here, what you'll find is that I have some kind of setup that, in this case, adds a lot of delay and reverb over here. This is kind of like a clap that turns into an atmosphere type sound. And what you'll see is that at some point, I just wanted to get rid of the delay and reverb. So you can see that I just cut out the rest of the sound. As you can see, if I move this further, you can see that the sound is still going. In fact, if I zoom in, you can still see the delay and reverb over here. But I just didn't want it, so you can just make it shorter. And that is a very easy way to get rid of any delay tails that you may have in particular parts of the sound. And actually, right before I go into mixing, I tend to freeze a lot of my elements that I know have a lot of delay and reverb. And then I can just go through all of the delay and reverb tails that I don't need and cut them off at the points that I don't need them anymore. Now, another reason why you might want to use resampling or freezing is because it allows you to commit to a sound. In this particular case, I had this sound over here. It is a little bit strange, it is a little bit wonky, but it does actually work in the context of the track. And one of the things that I had to do is really convince myself that that was true. And one of the ways that I did that is by resampling it so that I cannot go back into the original patch and continue tweaking things and changing things and stuff like that. But instead, I just have to work with this audio and try to make something of that. Now, ironically, for the next tip, I cannot show you the sound that this tip is inspired by because I actually resampled it. As you can see over here, we have the sound. And in this particular case, we just have a reverb and a utility on it. But of course, those have nothing to do with the actual tip that I wanted to talk about, and that was using presets in effect plugins. Because of course, we've probably all looked at a lot of different presets for our favorite synths, but when it comes to effect plugins, that is often where the real magic happens. Let's take a different sound as an example of that. This is just the sound without any of the effects. And then when we turn on all of the effects, you can hear what a big difference just using effects makes. Not only do we get the ambience, we get more of the tone that we like from the EQ, but we also get this sparkling idea from the spectral resonator over here set to the granular mode. And this is still just mainly using Ableton devices. When it actually comes to big effect plugins like Shaperbox 3 over here, as an example, you can see that you get a lot of different presets. In this case, there's so many presets loaded that it actually starts to lag when I open them up all. Here's another example of a great plugin that I sometimes just like to open up and browse different presets. As you can see, we have different categories over here. And again, in terms of just the sheer amount of presets that you have, there's quite a lot of these. And the main thing that you should probably take away from this is that time that you're spending browsing presets in your synth is also time that you can sometimes spend browsing presets in effect plugins. Like if you have a preset that sounds really close but not exactly the way that you want it, maybe you know an effect that can get very close to it. For example, I know that this Lunacy comes with a lot of particle sprays over here, which is very cool for kind of shimmering sounds or particle sounds or whatever you want to call it. To be honest, I don't know the exact proper name for this kind of stuff. I always imagine it kind of like a granular synthesizer high kind of bell sound. And that was also how I made the kind of sparkly texture that you hear in, for example, this sounds that I showed before. We had this little bit of the sound over here, and then the preset is just copying it over and doing the rest up until this point over here, which is ultimately what I ended up freezing to get the sound that I have now. So that's it. That is everything that I want to talk about for today. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you learned something. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content, so I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.